Shalom and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Karen Sethill, and I'm speaking to you from the Eran Laor Map Room and the National Library of Israel in Jerusalem. A very warm welcome to all of you for this joint event of the European Day of Jewish Culture and the National Library of Israel's virtual international reading room. For the past 6 years, the library has been running a dedicated program called Gesher LeEuropa, A Bridge to Europe, to strengthen our connections between heritage and cultural organizations in Europe. Our partnership with the AEPJ on the European Day of Jewish Culture has been one of the highlights of this initiative and has brought us into contact with the many dedicated people working to promote Jewish heritage across Europe. It has also enabled us to share the library's very rich collections through our thematic exhibitions, which have been translated into many languages. And we're delighted to be in our 5th year of this collaboration. And this is a very good time to thank our friends and colleagues, Victor Sorensen, Frederico Schaba, Assumptio Hosta, and all of the task force. And it has been a real pleasure working with all of you. And I'd also like to thank my colleague at the NLI, Olga Lempert, who has managed the production of this exhibition that we're launching today down to the very last detail. Jewish journeys. Well, my journey to the meeting in Tbilisi last year, where this year's theme was discussed, seemed such an obvious way to be going about business, but now that seems just a distant dream. When we started to unpack the Jewish journey theme for this year's exhibition, and that was before Corona, we knew that we wanted to address different aspects of journeys as part of the Jewish story, beyond tracing the complex web of Jewish arrivals and departures, to also describe the spiritual, social, and cultural aspects of these travels. We could now add another chapter about the unexpected virtual journeys that we are all taking today with the help of technology. In fact, the library has established a new archive to document Jewish life under COVID-19, and we're inviting people to send us Jewish digital materials that reflect COVID's impacts on our lives. And Doron will be putting up the email address to note to where to send those materials. However, throughout history, well before the digital age, people dreamt of journeys to Jerusalem and to the Holy Land. And in this room, we have many maps describing imaginary journeys to Jerusalem by people who never actually came here. I'm delighted, and it's with great pleasure that I introduce Jeremy Leigh to lead our virtual journey for this next hour. Jeremy teaches Israel Studies and Jewish History at the Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem, and for the last 20 years has directed Jewish Journeys, developing Jewish travel around the world. He's written a book called Jewish Journeys. You'll get a link about that. It's available on Amazon. And Jeremy is very important for this event. He's a member of the scientific committee of the AEPJ, Developing Roots of Jewish Heritage. We're really delighted, Jeremy, that you've been able to join us, and I'm handing over to you now. Thank you.
Hi, Karen. Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, and hello to everybody. Just a few brief words, and then I think I'm going to turn it over to the screen share. But first of all, I just want to thank, well, everybody, Karen in particular, and Victor and the people of the APJ for the invitation to address the topic, and also the invitation to kind of, as it were, carry over projects that we've already started over the years. You know what? I think I'm going to go straight to this because I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I want to make sure that we get to cover all the things we want to talk about. So let's go to here, and then we can. Whoopsie daisy! There we go. So, as a topic. Nothing could, in a way, sort of seem more topical. I mean, Karen, you mentioned it, which is in an age or in a period where we can't travel, or travel has suddenly been limited, then in a way, sort of the experience forces everybody to think in a sort of a more imaginative way about the idea of what travel is all about. The title that I wanted to share here is, it's not my own. It's borrowed from this chap over here, Isaac Deutscher, who may or may not be familiar with any of you. He was an important a historian, journalist. He was Jewish. He grew up in Poland. He in a religious environment, and then very much moved away from religious life and became actually a very key active activist in left-wing politics. He left Poland and spent the rest of his life in the UK, thereby avoiding the horrors of the Holocaust, and was a biographer of Trotsky, amongst other things, and wrote a very important book, I think, called The Non-Jewish Jew, the title of which is there on the page. But anyway, the point of the title is this, that he was asked once in a lecture to kind of make a comment on this idea about roots, that roots travel, how Jews have roots. And because it was an emerging topic and discourse about people looking to work out where they came from. And seemingly in a fit of frustration or anger, probably more frustration, I think, he kind of, blurted back, trees have roots, but Jews have legs. And it seemed to me a fascinating and lovely way to kind of take us into this topic, because in a way what Deutsche was trying to capture was sort of something which goes to the heart of this topic. Is the Jewish experience characterized by being rooted in one place, or to what degree is it rooted in movement, in the way in which we move between places? That legs, in a way, are far more important to being Jewish than anything else. And thereby we begin our journey for the next sort of brief amount of time that we have together, which is to ask this question. And it's there beautifully curated in the exhibition that Karen and the colleagues have put together for the project, the European Days of Jewish Culture. But we're kind of asking this question: how do we think about journeys within the Jewish people? Is it defined? I mean, it throws up almost all of the big topics that we would normally want to think about. The notion of place, for instance. Is it about the single place, or is it about being between places? A journey, after all, is about travel between. And therefore, is the place or the significance, whether it's, well, on whatever level, cultural, religious, political, philosophical, and so on, where is the focus of our attention when we think about this idea of journeys? And these are just a sort of selected maps to illustrate. I mean, the number of maps, if we could think about the journeys that the Jewish people have taken over the years, through the centuries and the millennia, of course, begs lots of different kind of ways of looking at it. But maybe if we kind of go to the definitive moments to sort of kick ourselves off, after all, the Jewish experience is born out of a number of critical kind of journeys which take place, both of which, or all of which, are described in the Bible. Most famously and most importantly, the moment where the Jewish people are born is through the journey of Avram, who receives a commandment. We sort of only loosely know a few details about him in the book of Genesis, in the book of Sefer Bereshit, but all of a sudden he's told to go on a journey, Lech Lecha, which is, to a place that God will show. And significantly, of course, it is a moment of transformation, not just for him, but of course for everything that goes with it, because really the purpose of the journey is a spiritual journey. But it is fair to say that that is a journey that is described for us as an individual one. I mean, it's symbolic, it's emblematic of others. And therefore, in a way, the national moment, the national journey of the Jewish people is the Exodus, Yetziat Mitzrayim, which we kind of obviously remember every year at Pesach. I mean, if one was to ask the question, do we have roots or do we have legs? Both of these stories would seem to suggest that transience and movement are the defining parts of our experience. But then let me take you to this. I mean, I've chosen to illustrate it through a painting by Marc Chagall. It's actually an interesting painting because it got stolen and suddenly popped up in an art auctioneer's office. But this picture of Jacob's dream, one of the most definitive journeys, also in the origins or the legends of origins of the Jewish people, where Jacob is fleeing and lies down to rest and has this revelation of a ladder descending from heaven, and the angels, the malachim, olim v'yordim bo, they arise and come down. And just thinking about that as a definitive moment, what are we intrigued by? I would say, what am I intrigued by? The journey is central to the moment of understanding, for revealing something important. And yet it's not about the place he came from, nor is it about the place that he's going to. Rather, it's a kind of a liminal space. Now, it's not as liminal as all that, but now's not the time to talk through all the commentaries on the text. But the idea that somehow being on the journey reveals great truth, insight, and wisdom. And that being the case, it sort of begs the question, at least for me, as we think about Jewish journeys on the broader meta level, individually, collectively, over time, what does that actually reveal for us? I mean, if nothing else, you know, before we only get lost in the Lech Lecha and the Yetziat Mitzrayim and the Sulam Yaakov, the Jacob's ladder or the dream, remember that, of course, the central part of the biblical story pivots around the notion of home. So in other words, journeying, does it take place within the home or only outside the home? The tremendous politics that are revealed in the Bible about the idea to centralize the religious cult or the religious practice in Jerusalem, or actually to centralize it anywhere, that becomes no less a defining part of the story. But it's important to say that given, is the definitive part the leaving of Egypt, the journey through the desert, or the arrival at the land? But most importantly, as we know, we expand that out. Actually, the defining story isn't about the presence, but actually one could argue, and now if we kind of pan out across time, the amount of time the Jewish people have spent in and around the land, but those other places as well, suddenly, crucially, other sites come into focus. Here I've just kind of clipped in the port in Yafo, the port in Jaffa, because it'll pop up, I think, probably in the next thing that I want to say, but to say that the number of journeys that are in relation to the land of Israel, but of course are about the journey away from it and towards it. Nothing could be more topical given the time of the year that we're in, not the time of history, but the time of year, one of what I'm going to argue is one of the Bible's finest moments in terms of describing journeys and a travel literature. And it both, by the way, it fits in pretty much all of the categories that we have in the wonderful exhibition that accompanies the days of Jewish culture. And that's just the passage, I mean, the whole of the book of Jonah, Sefer Yonah, which is read in the afternoon of Yom Kippur, is about, I mean, is one enormous travel journey. And I'm not, again, I mean, time for, I'm sure for many people watching, the time is coming soon when, you know, we'll sit down and kind of look at it or read it or be aware of the fact that it's being read. But the number of journeys and transition moments that take place in that story, I just wanted to pick up one. By the way, I mean, I didn't include the text on here, but, you know, Jonah departs from the port of Jaffa, and he's given the choice to go in one direction or the other, to Nineveh or to Tarshish. I mean, even that idea alone, it's not even the question of where we came from, but the insecurity, the lack of clarity, the question mark that hangs over where will the Jewish journey actually reveal something. But critically for us, and for me, I have to say it is more beautiful, powerful, awesome, and inspiring as a moment of Jewish travel literature, is that moment when Jonah has set sail, and of course God sends the great storm, and all the non-Jews on the boat who are troubled by this, and they find Jonah and they ask him the question, which is the text that I put up here, and you know, who are you, and where do you come from? And if ever there was a question that is about a single definitive moment in what a journey represents, individually and collectively, is the idea that travel reveals identity. We reveal ourselves, both to ourselves and to others, in the act of going on a journey. And the fact that this is the story that we choose for the most sacred day of the Jewish calendar on Yom Kippur, I think probably speaks volumes. And of course, you know, what Jonah says when he is confronted by these questions is, Anochi Ivri, I am a Hebrew. You know, in other words, the journey has forced him to confront and reveal both to himself and to his and to the people, you know, whose life he's endangering, exactly who he is. Now, of course, it would be just such a happy ending if it all ended there. But of course, as we know, there are many journeys that lie ahead. In a way, I'm going to pause it on this just for one moment to say that, of course, having already dived into this as a topic, I am aware of the fact that people describe journeys through all manner of different disciplines and lenses and modes of understanding. You know, are we looking at this in religious terms? Is this about religious revelation? Is this philosophical? Is this cultural? I come from the world of education, sort of marrying together education. I mean, my subject matter is history, but I practice it in the field of education. And there, of course, education goes as wide as you possibly can. So for me, all of these ideas collide and they all connect in all of this to say, education is about revealing truth and understanding and gaining better understanding of whatever it is, us or the world around us. And what an amazing statement about the nature of Jewish tradition to kind of sanctify the story of a turbulent journey, a journey of running away and towards a story to which God is involved, but God is only a bit player, and a journey that involves Jews and non-Jews facing off against each other or meeting each other. And of course, by the way, the ultimate version, which is what is troubling Jonah so much, is the fact he has to go to the enemy of the Israelites and ask them to, and encourage them to ask for forgiveness. So keeping ourselves moving, maybe one last little piece, just to kind of sort of capture a little bit of that idea, that question that was asked, which is, this whole year of the day of Jewish culture, but really this kind of whole year of investigation of our topic, which is about journeying. Is journeys, when it comes to the Jews, what does it force us to confront? And here I've kind of sort of put it in words. Is it about being still, the point of arrival, and settling down and being on our land or being in our home? Or is it about movement and all the things that I think Deutsche was referring to? The transience, the temporary nature of what a journey represents, the dangerous nature, not just physically, but spiritually, religiously, politically, however else you want to describe it. And so, what is so remarkable is swift on the heels of the Day of Atonement of Yom Kippur comes Sukkot, where we have, I think, all of that embodied in the most remarkable moment, because the practice of Sukkot is to sit in these small temporary shelters of Sukkot, where we sit and we don't move, and we imagine guests coming to us, and yet it is a symbol of our transience and the insecurity of life and the journey through the desert, or however else one wants to imagine it. So I suppose I'm leaving it sort of hanging there a little bit to try and work out, to sort of try and emphasize, is Judaism about roots or legs? Is it about stillness or transience, permanence, temporariness? We'll just leave that one sitting there for a moment. And so let's kind of investigate a little bit more about the nature of where the Jewish journey might take us. And I'll just say, to kind of explain where this is going to go, I just wanted this next little section, or a kind of an area of some thoughts, sort of reflective thoughts, picking up a few of what for me would be some of the important questions, I think, that go with this. And then we'll get to a kind of a more concrete version of it in the last part of what we're doing. So I picked up on this story, which is the story of the Ethiopian Jewish community and their festival of Sigd, which is a festival that begins in the Ethiopian tradition, which is on the right of the screen here, far away, but imagining and praying towards Jerusalem. The synagogue in the Gondar gathers the people together, and they look for hundreds of years towards Jerusalem. It is a journey of the imagination, and one thinks about how much that sort of is central to our experience. And yet, because of modern history, and again, I'm really kind of sidestepping any politics involved, but to say that for the majority of the Ethiopian Jewish community, Sigd continues, but it continues now with far less imagination, but rather the annual looking out over Jerusalem. And one asks the question, and it's a question that is both rhetorical but also very real for members of the community: which is the more powerful? Which one moved people in a far more, dealing with the imagination or dealing with reality? And that, I think, by the way, it's a little bit, maybe I'm reducing it down a little bit, and maybe I'm belittling it a little bit, but to say that I think this year brought a little bit of that. During Pesach, it's not that every year we don't say L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, except that for so many people, and the notion of accentuated imagination kind of, I think, entered into people's lives in a very different kind of way. But let me take us here to a different journey. This is a journey to the furthest west of the Roman Empire, to the archaeological site today of Volubilis in Morocco, which was part of the Roman Empire. And there's pretty much nowhere in the Roman Empire that did not have Jews, after a certain point, brought as slaves at various different stages of the growth of the empire. And archaeologists discover in Volubilis a small shard of pottery on which is written some Hebrew letters. And the Hebrew letters spell the text that I put on the right, in Matrona bat Rabbi Yehuda nach, the generic name of a character of a woman, but named as the daughter of Rabbi Yehuda, rests. We don't know much about this. We don't know, exactly who the daughter of Rabbi Yehuda was. All I wanted to refer us to is that, again, no less a formative experience of a Jewish journey, which was the journey of being brought to the far reaches of an empire when our home was destroyed. And what I wanted to kind of pose in this slide was to ask the question, what's the imagination at this point, where the Jews have been exiled from their land? And this isn't the big collective, sitting by the waters of Babylon, Al Naharot Bavel. This is a small, tiny group of Jews who found themselves in one city far away from any other Jews, possibly not knowing that the Jewish people had survived the destruction of the temple. What was that imagination like? Now, again, it's not just a rhetorical question to imagine them. I suppose the question that I'm really asking is, what does it do for us to imagine their imaginings, their journey, and knowing all the journeys that we've been on since? What do we imagine? If we could correspond with them, how might we explain the next stages of what that journey might have brought them? And as we go through, maybe, by the way, just to include this, and of course there are a number of examples, but I'll give you this one. I mean, it's a treasure that sits in the National Museum of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is the Sarajevo Haggadah. A Haggadah which was written somewhere in Castile before, actually in the early part of the 14th century, and journeyed out and found its home in Sarajevo, one of the great centers of the Sephardi exile, and has been through tremendous kind of turmoil there, particularly through persecution in the 20th century, particularly during the Shoah, where it was rescued by Muslim officials, and then in the turbulence of the war at the end of the 20th century. But just to capture that as a moment for understanding a Jewish journey, the book contains the story of a journey. It was written to be read at Pesach, to remember a journey out of Egypt, and yet we would look at it in the museum as an expression of the journey that the book actually took. Again, it's a different type of imagining, but I guess what I'm trying to do is to layer up the kind of encounters in which artifacts and legacies of history give us insights, or rather sharpen our question about the nature. I wonder, by the way, I mean, I have to say I have done this on various occasions visiting, is to stand around that exhibition, that site in the exhibition, with a group of people, and not to do the full-blown Seder, but at least to try and kind of reignite some of the questions that we might ask every year at the Seder table, and ask to what degree does standing in the war-torn and rebuilt and turbulent city of Sarajevo, what does it mean to stand and look at that book, knowing where that book has journeyed to, and so on, to reflect on all the other places that we've traveled. I invite you to kind of to check into the exhibition that has been put together for the Day of Culture, which references obviously the Catalan Mahzor, which is in the National Library, which tells no less, I think, a remarkable story. And maybe to bring it together a little bit, a couple of thoughts from the more contemporary era, and maybe just to give a little passage. This is from Amos Oz. It's actually not from Makom Acher, elsewhere perhaps, a book that he wrote early in his writing career, but it sort of sums up a little bit of, I think, what he was maybe trying to get across. This actually was from an interview. But he says, in 1992, he says, often around 5 or 6 o'clock, I see an elderly woman on the kibbutz sitting on a bench. Now, Amos Oz grew up in Jerusalem and moved to kibbutz Hulda, and which is really where he writes the first part of his kind of sort of literary outpouring before he later on moved to Arad. But, certainly in the period of emerging of one of the great writers of Israel. And he's describing a scene that it has both literary and I think kind of biographical quality to it. But he says, often around 5 or 6 o'clock, I see an elderly woman sitting on the kibbutz on a bench, singing to herself. And I don't know what she sings because it's Polish. And I think to myself, that woman 45 years ago must have been a romantic girl with braids sitting by a stream somewhere in Poland, singing a Hebrew song about Jerusalem. And everything I write is just a footnote or a commentary on that scene. And I love that description, because what he seems to be suggesting is that it's an endemic part of our story, even when we have arrived home, or even when we are just, now in the latter years of our lives, wherever we may be, sitting and stopped moving, we remain the restless people. The journey is actually an endemic part of the experience, and therefore the literary journey takes us to something else. I'm kind of intrigued by this. This actually popped up as an art project that appeared as a kind of piece of public art in Jerusalem, and it's been copied and shown various other places, but it has that passage, again, as a piece of sort of contemporary street art, a picture of an Israeli backpacker and the passage from Lech Lecha, from Abraham's journey, Lech Lecha me'artzecha u'mimoladetcha, go from your land and from the place where you were born, or from your father's house or your family house. And here we have the Israeli backpacker staring at the sights of Berlin, the Siegersäule, the Brandenburg Gate, and so on. What is the artist trying to say to us about the nature of the Jewish journey? Is the backpacker looking and realizing that they have left their home to come here? This is the place that God was showing them? Or are they realizing that this is the place that they have to leave in order to return to their home? And so just to round these pieces together, really to draw together a fantastic sort of piece in one of the great pieces of contemporary Israeli poetry by the beautiful, wonderful work of Yehuda Amichai in his final book, Patuach Sagur Patuach, closed, open, open, closed, open, which is a whole suite of poems called Jewish Travel. And I'm really kind of apologizing to the memory of Amichai, because I'm just giving a one line or a couple of lines, but he describes Jewish travel, and he says Jewish travel, or the Jewish journey, however one translates it, is not a hike to see a tall mountain in all of its glory, nor a climb to rejoice in the vistas of nature, but a hike with a purpose, to seek help from the high heavens. And for me, that is what encapsulates, whether we're looking at this from the religious, the cultural, the philosophical, the Jewish journey is really not about the recreational travel. I mean, yes, there is recreation involved, but it is a journey to try and discover something, whether it's to seek help from the high heavens, to gain insight, to learn more about us individually, collectively, and so on. And for me, it's one of the most wonderful life-affirming expressions, given the fact that we know how turbulent Jewish history has been. So let me lead you to the other topic that was on the title for this this session, which is to refer to a sanctified journey which emerged in the Western world about 250 years ago, which became known as the Grand Tour. Now, I don't want to spend lots of time on it, but really I'm just leveraging it kind of to make a kind of a point. Post-Enlightenment sort of Europe, and then by extension, the New World of America, kind of curates the journey, that becomes a sanctified journey, known as the Grand Tour, whereby the idea is to be a person of enlightenment, to be a person of insight or wisdom, a person representing European or Western culture. One must go on a journey to the roots of one's culture. And what does that mean? Largely speaking, it means going to Rome and to Athens, but by no means exclusively. And somehow one returns a kind of a bigger or a better or a wiser, more insightful person. It begs at least the question about, where does pilgrimage fit into our conversation? After all, Christianity has many different pilgrimages. In Catholicism, the journey to the Vatican. In Islam, the Hajj, to the sites of Mecca. Judaism had a pilgrimage tradition back in the days when the temple stood, but it doesn't really have a canonized, formalized version of what pilgrimage represents. And by the way, the intriguing thing about pilgrimage is that it offers the opportunity of fulfillment, of completion. Now, by no means is it the entirety of life? But it is certainly an important stage of life. What does it mean to be a people with a culture and a tradition that doesn't offer that? And it leads me to kind of think about that. I quickly this morning sort of threw this one in because it seems so topical. I'm absolutely not going anywhere near the politics of what's going on in Israel at the moment. But the need of Jews, particularly of the Bratslav Hasidic kind of movement, but by the way, many other Jews, I think, in Israel and around the world, to visit the site of Rabbi Nachman, who's buried in Uman in Ukraine. And in the time of COVID, all the controversies about whether that is good or a bad thing. And the language that is being sort of given, which says, certainly by those who are saying that in spite of the health risks or acknowledging the health risks, somehow the health of the soul of the Jewish people needs to be kind of expressed and kind of held on to by visitation, by journeying, by going to a place. Again, I am absolutely not going near the politics of whether it's right for people to travel or not. I'm just saying that if we were in a different age and different era or different period of history, maybe we could investigate that question of whether Judaism has evolved a pilgrimage tradition. But it's interesting, by the way, the choice that somehow this accrues to a very distinctive type of Western civilization. The idea of sanctifying a journey is not the only model, of course. I mean, I'm going to choose this one as well and introduce this language, which, of course, I'm going to then manipulate to my advantage. If you're into the community of Scottish mountaineers, there is I realize if any of you who are watching this may or may not be your thing, and you may not understand a word of what I'm talking about, but there are a significant number of mountains in Scotland which are above a certain height, and I apologize to anyone who for whom this is their thing, because I've forgotten the height that it's relevant for, but they're known as Munros. And the idea is that to be an accomplished climber, one should bag them. English terminology or Scottish terminology of collecting all of them. One needs to have been on the sanctified sacred route of very, very tall mountains. It's a different version. Is it culture, or is it about standing on a mountain, or is it just about collecting things in the same way that we collect, well, whatever we might collect? And so for me, this is the question, and it goes right to the heart of our theme, and it goes right to the heart of this as a topic. If there was a version of Jewish Munro bagging, of collecting all the sites that represent the Jewish story, or the idea of the grand tour, a Jewish grand tour, where would that actually take us to? What would be the sanctified Jewish journeys that we would somehow be seeing our Jewish communities or our Jewish travel agents or our travel agents selling things to the Jewish people? What would that include? And that, for me, is a source of great fascination. So I want to just dwell for a little bit on this, because I'm actually going to put up a couple of options here, or kind of, maybe represented in a couple of ways. I put this one. Now, 3 sites, and they're not random. I mean, I've deliberately put them onto the same slide. We have the Arch of Titus, which stands in Rome, and it represents that sort of victory expression of the Roman Empire to kind of the Jewish humiliation or the Jewish defeat back in the days, obviously, of the time of the Second Temple, and that iconic image of the menorah, of the candelabra being taken into exile, being a permanent symbol of our humiliation. That embodies exile more than anything else, I think, in tangible form that belongs to a Jewish journey. And yet, I am intrigued how many tour guides, when they stand by the Arch of Titus, would speak about the Arch of Titus in the way that, well, I'm guessing many of you might, and certainly I would. Let me combine it with the Schumann Memorial on the banks of the Danube. This very powerful and tragic and quite political monument, really, represents the story how Jews in Budapest were murdered by the Hungarian Arrow Cross in the last months of 1944, and their bodies fell into the Danube. Now, importantly, and to kind of get this correct, we'd have to kind of look behind the Shoe Monument, not in front onto to the Danube, but behind it is the Parliament. The Hungarian Parliament that embodies sort of the sacred values of Hungarian identity is also just behind it, or in front of it, however one wants to look at it, is the site of the great betrayal of Hungarian citizenship, where Jews were murdered by their neighbors. And then the one at the top, which is probably a little less well known, maybe, the view from the Javari Church in Meskheta in Georgia, the old ancient capital of Georgia, which according to legend contains, well, looks out over to the site, but the whole area of Meskheta contains the ancient kind of narratives that define the emergence of the Georgian Orthodox Church, which contains within it a very different version of the story of the death of Jesus and the Jewish relationship to it, where Jews are not considered the murderers of Jesus, but rather the people that brought the sacred objects back to Georgia, thus beginning the beginning of Georgian Christianity. Again, I mean, this is, of course, a much, much longer one, and I invite everybody, I mean, we'll talk about it later when we get to talk about European roots of heritage and the AEPJ project, which myself and my colleagues are all involved in. But Georgia is one of those roots. It is a symbol of tremendous acceptance. And so therefore, I'm kind of posing that rhetorical question. Of course, you may have already got it. Why have I put these three as somehow belonging to the Grand Tour? Because I'm interested in themes as well as places. And the theme that you're seeing here is exactly that. Different commentaries on the question of Jews and their relationship to place and their level of acceptance and rejection. The ultimate rejection is murder. The secondary level of rejection is forced exile. And yet in that exile, albeit that it predates according to the mythology, actually goes back to the time of the First Temple, the story of Meskheta and Georgia, where Jews are actually a very different kind of group of people. In other words, I'm encapsulating what for me are sites of the Grand Tour of the Jewish journey that are about power, having power, powerlessness, not having power, and the interaction between them. Now, this actually ironically works very well as a virtual journey, because there's no way without a lot of carbon footprint we could do on one journey, Rome, Budapest, and Meskheta. But nonetheless, the idea that how do we weave together a story? They're not individual places now. They are now sites on a journey. Let me take you to this one. Are these on the Grand Tour? So I've given you the Yad Zikaron synagogue at the bottom on the left, which is in Salonika, or Thessaloniki, and it contains on the wall plaques of all the synagogues that were destroyed in the Great Fire of Salonika in 1917, which were all the synagogues that were created by the Salonika Jewish community from their arrival in the city at the time of the Sephardi exile following 1492. And it's an amazing set of just names. You go to one synagogue, much more recently built, but you are being reminded of the collective and community journeys of the Jewish people to be in that synagogue. And it's about presence in that synagogue, but of course what you're being asked to look at in that synagogue are the names of the places where we have come from. And it really is, I have to say, both a beautiful experience to pray with the Salonika Jewish community, but to be in that site. On the right of the screen is the site of the Hochschule, which was the seminary or the intellectual center that represented, well, I would say the world of non-orthodoxy. A lot of reform, but not exclusively, in Berlin in the period before the Second World War. And obviously we know everything that happened in Berlin. Today, by the way, it is actually has gone back to being used as a site of Jewish learning. And at the top, I've given you in the center is the site of the Schulhoef. Now, it's not the site, it's the site of the Schulhoef. It's now actually been excavated more recently, but possibly one of the most remarkable sites of Jewish diaspora life, where everything was clustered together in pre-war Vilnius. The Great Synagogue, the Strashun Library, the first really kind of pluralist Jewish library in the world, where all the streams of knowledge were there to be seen and people to be seen reading the books that one would find in that, all destroyed, obviously either by the Nazis or by the Soviets, the very last remnants at the end. Now, I've included them deliberately on one slide in order to make a point, because if I was weaving together these sites of the Jewish journey, what do they have in common? These are places where the great palaces, the great triumphs of Jewish culture and civilization and learning and thirst for knowledge and insight are all to be found. What we could only imagine to have sat in the library of the, to sit in the, around the tables of the Strashun library and imagined all the other books that were being read by all the other people that were around at really one of the epicenters of Jewish intellectual and cultural greatness, and on the cusp of the Enlightenment or the post-Enlightenment world of Berlin, and the entire heritage of knowledge of Sephardi wisdom that came to Salonika. Again, I'm not just putting them there to kind of tell a kind of a magnificent and melodramatic story. It's a very real question. I mean, in real terms, what is the conversation that's going on between those three sites? Not just about history, but about insight, wisdom, and learning. Keeping an eye, making sure that we have time for some questions as well. Now, this is a tricky one because at some point we're going to have to encounter this. So I'm really kind of putting this one in to kind of complicate the question of how we think about what journeys are about. And this is really about the direction. So you could go back to any of the sites that we've gone before, and the much tougher question is, what order would you go to those sites? What order would you go? What comes first? Do you start in Mescheta because it's chronological, or do you finish in Mescheta because it's optimistic given the other kind of stories that were on that slide? So I've chosen the iconic image of the railway tracks that lead into Birkenau. In the earlier part of the death machine in Birkenau, the railway tracks stopped outside, but in the last years, from 44 onwards, the tracks went all the way in. And of course, for tourists today, who are logically going to a site, which I have to say, I mean, it's a complicated Jewish site if ever there was one, because it's actually a German site, or it's a Nazi site. It's a German Nazi site. But nonetheless, we visit it looking for some sort of discussion about Jewishness. And we know everything about what happened. We don't know everything about what happens. But my question is this: as one goes towards what has become an iconic site of the Jewish journey, actually what I would always do, and it's become sort of something almost of a mantra in conversations about Jewish travel, is to stop before we go in and just ask ourselves, hang on a minute, what are we really interested in? Which direction should we be standing, with our back to the death camp or with our front to the death camp? In other words, are we looking to discover how we were murdered, or are we looking to discover the places that we came from, where we lived before we were sent there? And that includes, by the way, complicated questions. I've chosen the Kahal Shalom synagogue in Rhodes, in Rhodos, because it was the furthest journey traveled by any one community, over 2,500 miles, to get from the island of Rhodes to get to Auschwitz. But actually, if I stopped there and ask, what, before I get lost in the crimes of the Nazis, what do I want to know about what was being destroyed and what was being lost? And if one expands that out onto the meta level, the Jewish journey reveals, I think, what's there at both ends. And so really the question that I think I'm asking here, and I think it's contained right at the very heart of the exhibition, is this: are we actually on the Jewish journey looking at a sanctified set of places, a canon, to use English parlance, a canon of place, where, like the Hajj or like the Christian pilgrimage, we have to go to certain places? Is it really about the canon of place, or is it much more about the canon of ideas, of questions, of concepts? In order to be a fulfilled Jew, I would need to be asking myself, oh, by the way, in order to tell the story of the Jews, what are the questions that I need to talk about? And there I've just put up a list of topics, I guess, which have been the topics of some of the journeys that I've led over the years. The discussion about power, the discussion about truth, about God, meaning, redemption, culture, disputation, ethics, morality. These, to me, are the essence of what the Jewish story is about, and why Judaism exists, and what the Jewish people have been about, including at home and including in exile or diaspora. Where are the places that I most want to go to in order to discover, to be the backdrop, to be both, not just a sacred site, but actually to be the interrogative site, the place that I can interrogate to find what I'm about? And so just the very, very last little part before we come to some time for some questions, really to flag up this, what I think is one of the most exciting projects that in a way parallels the European Days of Jewish Culture, which we're celebrating today or acknowledging today. But it's the story of Jewish heritage, the European roots of Jewish heritage, as a project sort of endorsed by the Council of Europe and carried through the AEPJ, the Association for Preservation and Promotion of Jewish Heritage in Europe, taking the mantle or the offer of the Council of Europe to represent Jewish cultural roots and heritage in Europe. What would they be? And of course, I mean, I apologize for anyone who's watching whose logo is not up here, but I put up the ones as just a small cluster. We went out and asked collectively members of the AEPJ, Jewish communities around Europe, Jewish and non-Jews representing the Jewish story, what roots do you have to offer? And of course, our project is to do a little bit of what I think the Council of Europe has in a way kind of gifted to the AEPJ or to those involved in Jewish heritage, which is in the same way that the Camino de Santiago de Compostela is one of the most visited heritage routes or pilgrimage routes endorsed by the Council of Europe in northern Spain. There is also the Mozart route, there is the olive tree route, there is the collective 30 sub-themes that in some way represent European heritage. As a Jew or somebody involved in Jewish education, heritage preservation, promotion, cultural endeavor, and so on, I'm fascinated to know, how do we tell our story when we're given the opportunity? So again, I apologize because I'm literally just flagging up one or two of them to make sure that we include them in this very short kind of presentation. But one of the routes, and by the way, I do invite everyone to kind of keep an eye on this, because the routes theoretically existed and they're all being massively upgraded by enormous amount of work through colleagues at the AEPJ and partners around the world, around Europe. But so I've just selected one or two of them, but this one is a fascinating one. I mean, it's also a particularly brilliant one, by the way, which is the medieval route of Rushy in the Champaign region of France. What's so interesting, and I have to say, I mean, I apologize to anyone who may be listening or watching who is involved in the route, because it's not a frustration I haven't shared before. We have very little material heritage to actually kind of find. We haven't, you know, what may have been the grave of Rushy was kind of was developed over many, many centuries ago. But we have one of the most important figures in Jewish culture, religious literature, insight of uncovering the truth of the commentary of Jewish text, and the Tosafists, the commentators that follow the tradition of Rashi, and they are all in the villages and the towns surrounding Troyes, which is where Rashi was from, and where the kind of the exhibition is held. A root of Jewish heritage that tells one of the most enduring European Jewish stories there is, of a commentator who's read, by the way, I mean, the medieval route of Rashi really belongs anywhere in the Jewish world where Rashi is being studied, is being located, actually, of all places, in the written word, in the text. The written word, the ultimate Jewish journey, or the imagined Jewish journey and the textual Jewish journey, that's where that version really of Rashi can be found. And yet, because we are who we are and because we know something of his biography, want to root it into a particular location. And maybe just one more, which is the Izmir project, which is the renovation and development of Jewish sites around in and around Izmir in Turkey. And what is so fascinating, and again, I'm going to latch on to one particular part of the Izmir story in order to make my point. Izmir was one of the centers of Jewish refuge after the expulsion from Spain, and therefore almost by definition was teeming with anusim, or conversos, people who'd converted to Christianity and stayed in Spain and at some point just Portugal and got out in years afterwards and really made up the port of Izmir. It is out of that community that the false messiah Shabbatai Tzvi emerged in the middle part of the 17th century, offering the Jewish world the chance of redemption, the end of our suffering, the ultimate expression of what the entire project of being Jewish is all about. And how remarkable that he spoke in, I mean, again, I mean, it's not spoiling the ending to say that, at least according to Jewish tradition, Shabbatai Tzvi was a false prophet or a false Messiah. But to revisit Izmir and to stand in these locations and imagine the conversations that took place in these synagogues about the very ultimate expression of the historical narrative. Is this the end of history? Is this the end of history? I would want to suggest that the Izmir project, or the visitation to Izmir, is not the only place where Jews discuss the end of history or the ultimate redemption. They've discussed it and continue to discuss it. That's an endemic part of the Jewish story. And so maybe just to kind of return to Isaac Deutscher, which is how we began, and really just to revisit that thought. To what degree are the Jewish people defined by their rootedness, their being in one place, or their transience? Again, I think it's pretty clear that the story of the Jewish people in the second half of the 20th century, but it includes the first half of the 20th century and into the 19th century, and continues to be and it's embodied, by the way, in the way in which we're doing this presentation, the return of the Jewish people on a collective level, and the achievement of Jewish sovereignty, and the ability to build amazing institutions on the land of Israel, such as, by the way, the National Library. I mean, if ever there was a fascinating notion of the repository of all the great cultural heritage and artifacts being now located in an ancestral homeland, that would probably bother Deutscher. Oh, by the way, Deutscher, fascinating guy, as a Trotskyite and not a great fan of Zionism, was a lot more sympathetic than maybe one may have thought. I mean, that's a discussion amongst his detractors. But or is it defined by all of what I've suggested here, which is it's defined by movement, by journeys, what this fantastic theme is really all about? When we think about the Jewish story, about Jewish culture, what we start to think about is transience. What have we picked up? What did we carry from home and take overseas? But to what degree has the Jewish story, in fact, been more unveiled in the diaspora or out of Israel than we could actually find at home? Cultural interaction, the porous, the open borders that exist when one lives in a society, even societies which have made life hard for the Jewish people, have had porous boundaries. Again, we're sort of keeping ourselves within the limits of time here, but I'll say that, by the way, the word that, seems to embody Jewish kind of closed-inness, which is the word ghetto. The first ghetto of Europe was in Venice. We know through history that certainly plenty of non-Jews came into the Venetian ghetto, and plenty of Jews interacted with non-Jews out of the ghetto. But for whatever reason, we were locked down during the nighttime and at various different stages, obviously in the daytime as well. So this question, what do we gain by being rooted, and what do we gain by being on the move and transience? For me, that is the great enduring and fascinating challenge, I think, of what this theme is all about. I'm taking myself off the presentation really just to acknowledge that in terms of formal parts, I'm pausing in the hope that there are some questions if anybody would like to kind of share any of their thoughts. I guess I'm going to probably go to Doron to feed them. But I hope that something in what has been said here, first of all, I hope will lead you to look a little bit more about the European Days of Jewish Culture, and certainly the Heritage Roots, which is a project which is just on the cusp of being unveiled. But anything that you want to talk about and share, and I would love to hear.
Yes, thank you very much. We have a few questions. From our audience abroad, we have Alfred from Bordeaux asks, in the project you mentioned of the routes in Europe, who is leading each of the routes? Jewish communities, public bodies? How do you work on the narratives of each of the routes?
Oh, wow, there's a question. I mean, throwaway little one. So who works on them? These are local. I mean, you know, it was a discussion. I mean, this is a project that's come through the AEPJ, which is an organization which has which is built for its members. I mean, that's a fantastic staff. So, and I'm just a kind of an outsider coming in to be useful. But this is a project where we very consciously, this was not going out to professional tour guides and professional writers. I mean, there are in some routes professional writers involved, but this is much more about people in locations writing their routes. I mean, in some cases, there are people who are connected to those locations elsewhere, but have deep connections to the places. So it has an organic character to it. And that, by the way, I mean, I don't know the degree to which one wants to go into this. I mean, this is, you know, I'm just involved in sort of trying to help and advise and make recommendations and suggestions. Federica, who is and Victor, who are the genius behind all of this, you know, there's a subtle politics. I mean, of course, there's a politics. How do we tell a story? I mean, in very, very simple terms, if I may just say this rhetorically, because obviously I'm just speaking to the screen here. I mean, I can see all of you that are there. Well, actually, those are on the other feed that I can't see. If you were to tell the story of your community, whether you're Jewish or not, if you were to tell the story, how would it sound if you were to tell the story differently to if I was to tell it? And by the way, I do want to just suggest, you know, I'm on a humbling level. I'm a Jewish educator. I work in the field of Jewish history, and that's my subject. I learn a route. You know, I mean, you're from Bordeaux. I was supposed to be taking a group to Alsace and Alsace-Lorraine to Strasbourg and Metz, which was, you know, before COVID. I mean, we got cancelled because of COVID. You know, it's a fascinating. What right do I have to tell a story as an outsider? You know, I read the books. I hope I listened to the people. I hope I represented their story. I personally would include in any journey. For me, it's almost wrong, I think, to tell the story only from the point of view of the outsider. So one wants to find a way to connect with people on the ground who will tell their story as well. And that makes up all the collective voices of the journey, of the route. So, I mean, you can see far more, you can find far more by going on and by the way, and obviously being in touch and looking at the website once it goes live and get a sense of it, and obviously be in touch with the AEPJ or myself.
Thank you very much. We have another question from our international audience. Jose from Madrid asks, as a connoisseur of the Jewish heritage in Europe and the institutions, how do you think the current situation of COVID will affect these projects?
Oh, I mean, it is the topic of the moment. Thank you for asking that. I mean, I'm going to stay, I mean, I don't want to sound sort of schmaltzy and kind of whatever, but I am going to say that for me, one part of being Jewish, whatever, who I am, I can't live in a world only of darkness and pessimism. So I'm going to work on the level that there is optimism built into this. Something will pass. And I'm looking to try and, as it were, predict and also leverage whatever we can from this moment. So I think that, I mean, I don't develop vaccines or cures, but I will just say that I do not believe that the human curiosity and certainly the desire to tell our stories will be quashed. Whether it comes back in 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, I have no idea. I'm pretty sure that after I mean, this is going to be a very melodramatic way of answering it, but I'm pretty sure of all the catastrophes that have befallen the Jewish people in Europe, maybe no one ever really thought at the time that anyone would ever go back to the Rhineland to tell the story of the Jews of the Rhine, or they would revisit Seville after the massacres of 1391, or actually all around Spain. But they do. So however dark the moment seems to be at the moment, and however kind of we are locked into this kind of living day by day, month by month, looking at our travel restrictions and worrying about masks and sanitizing, this is going to be with us, and as long as culture exists, and as long as the opportunity to kind of, as long as the human mind has the curiosity to travel. I mean, I think you're asking a fascinating question, because I think there may be people who will say, you know, I really wanted to travel and I'm too frightened, and maybe this has thrown me off travel, and when I finally get to be able to travel again, maybe I won't be in a position to be able to, either economically and so on. So the best I can say, I think is one of which is a kind of a sort of a generic collective view. I mean, I will just say, and this is a question which, I'll say I've encountered in a positive way. I mean, I would rather, I mean, obviously no one wants the pandemic, But actually, I think one of the things that has happened, the very fact that we are doing this sort of the way we are, is that it has forced us to reimagine or to go back to one of the most original primal versions of the Jewish journey. I mean, without sounding too cliched, for quite a few hundreds, thousands of years, the Jewish people did virtual tourism pretty well. So in other words, the fact that people can't come to Israel through the sort of periods of exile or now, or we can't travel around the world to wherever we want to go, that just makes us kind of, you know, sharpens our senses and gets us back. And I have to say, it's an amazing challenge to kind of, you know, to kind of make presentations, this or other ones, trying to do virtual Jewish journeys. I'm finishing now a course on virtual Sephardi journey, 12 hours of stuff through Jewish Renaissance in the UK, and we have a new one, whatever. I mean, you know, it's a fascinating challenge, which I don't think I would have got otherwise. So I'd rather we didn't have a pandemic, but I think it's kind of produced something positive in a kind of macabre kind of way.
Absolutely, thank you. I can say on our part that it's wonderful to have all these people from all over the world participating. There are many compliments in the chat, and I just want to read one of them by Beverly. She writes, "This is such a brilliant and illuminating talk. It's making me dizzy with all the new ideas and recasting of old perceptions." So that's one, and I'll be sure to send you the transcript of the chat so you can see all of them. Noreen asked, you mentioned the idea of pilgrimage in Judaism, and of course we have the 3 pilgrim festivals and going up to Jerusalem.
Yeah. So absolutely, and that of course is that is one of these sort of great topics to this. I mean, in other words, when we sort of don't do this as a short version, but we do the longer version. I'm teaching a course on the Grand Tour, actually, to my students at HUC in the United States, actually tomorrow, exactly on this topic. What is the meaning of pilgrimage in Jewish tradition? Because we had it. And by the way, as I said, I was keen to say that it brought its controversy. I mean, in the Bible, one can feel the opposition to the idea of a centralized sanctuary, but once it existed, we had it. And then, of course, it was lost after the destruction of the temple. So it has produced, I think, a fascinating and quite sharp politics. If one says on the non-controversial level, we reenact, we reimagine. I mean, there's a whole part of the liturgy of the prayer service which imagines and talks about the visiting and the sites that took place, you know, during the pilgrimage festivals. We've substituted the journey to kind of sacrifice in the temple with, you know, I mean, in classic, very simple kind of almost overused terms, through acts of charity and, you know, stakam gemilut chasadim, of acts of righteousness. So, you know, it's something of the elasticity and the kind of the clever way in which Judaism, I think, has adapted to take what was once a physical pilgrimage and now to cast it into an imagined pilgrimage, but giving it some characteristic to it. I mean, something tangible to do. I can't make the journey. I mean, I have to say, I'm on a Netziv in South Jerusalem, and I kind of, you know, whenever I leave my neighborhood, I look out over the you know, the city to where the temple used to stand, and, you know, and I can marvel at the site of the mosque there, and I love it. I mean, it's a wonderful, beautiful site, and acknowledges, you know, it's a lot quieter when you look at it from a distance than going down and sort of feeling the politics of it up close. But, you know, to imagine that actually the most important part actually was included in actually one part of the it's actually one of the Psalms. In one of the Shir HaMa'alot, one of the Songs of Ascent, it uses the phrase, Hayinu k'cholmin. You know, when we imagined, we were like dreamers. So, you know, Hayinu k'cholmin. So the idea that when we were going on a pilgrimage, we were dreaming of what we would be fulfilled there, I don't think the dream has disappeared. In other words, like, you know, cholmim, you know, we imagine or we dream of something else. So I think the idea is that it's there, and I think that is, by the way, is the interesting part. Well, A, what have we substituted for pilgrimage and fulfillment? And also, you know, as I tried to intimate before, you know, do we include the Jewish version of the Grand Tour as a type of pilgrimage, or just a really interesting and engaging cultural tour or visitation? That one is rhetorical.
Thank you very much. Elka asked a wonderful question. There's a rich literature of Jewish travel writing from antiquity to modern period. How do you relate to the many ways that Jews have understood places and places where over the ages?
Thank you. So this is going to sound very cheap, and I promise you, I said it because it made me think, but I'm not advertising my book. I'm just going to reference something in it. You know, many years ago, sat down and tried to write this book, Jewish Journeys, and what came out was sort of a cluster of personal bits and a little bit of stuff that I've spoken about here, but I tried to include within it sort of a small sample of what you've just mentioned, this very rich travel literature. By the way, it is interesting, in the modern period and through previous periods, we have Jewish travel literature hasn't been codified in quite the same way. There aren't rich anthologies of Jewish travel literature where, I guess, contemporary sort of anthology collectors have done all of that. It's something which I've tried to include in my teaching, but I think all of that is there, and you know, I think for me that is the intrigue. I mean, I think that when one reflects over all of this, what it lets us know is that Jewish journeys have had both functional and spiritual or kind of idealistic elements to them. So if one reads the travel literature that is created by Jewish travelers who are traveling for the purposes of trade, so that's a functional type of travel, what that type of travel revealed for them, say in the Middle Ages, was the chance to interact with Jewish communities who, you know, would never have had a chance to meet with. So I appreciate the comment, and or at least the kind of the reference, and I would encourage on the back of what you just said, you know, for those who are interested, you know, to kind of kind of discover that. I mean, by the way, and it's embedded. I mean, there's travel literature in the Talmud, there's travel literature in the early kind of exilic period, and obviously, you know, there is a wonderful compendium, one small little compendium that was produced in English by the Jewish Publication Society of medieval travelers through the ages. And then obviously as we get to the modern period, we have lots of other travel literature. And it's, it, of course, by the way, has small, if I may just reference, maybe bring in one other part. I mean, I don't want to sugarcoat the version of what the Jewish journey and Jewish transience has been about. Journeys that took place because of tragedy, you know, they're very powerful. I mean, the notion of the wandering Jew as a piece of Christian mythology, you know, it has produced a kind of a self-reflection. So, for instance, the collection that was produced very, very soon after the Holocaust, after Shoah, of survivors going back to visit the places where they grew up. So, kind of the memory, the Yiskabuch, the memory books that were created by people who collected them from Polish Jews who went back to Poland to discover what was left. That sits for us. I mean, there's a sort of various reprints of it. It's called From a Ruined Garden. It's an amazing piece of travel literature, if you want to see it in those terms, of people going back, knowing that they're not going to stay there, but using it as a kind of as a trigger to imagine all the greatness that was lost. That, I think, fits together with all the other pieces that we, I think, have going on here. And of course, the last one to mention is the emergence, maybe the way in which those have become the inspiration for contemporary writers. I gave only a couple of mentions before. Maybe just one, if I was to include it, is Aleph Bet Yehoshua's great book, Journey to the End of the Millennium, where he imagines the arrival in somewhere around the end of the first millennium, Sephardi and Ashkenazi Jews meeting to discuss in Central Europe the question of what became known as the Great Symposium or Dispute of Minds. Actually, he sets it in Paris on the question of whether polygamy should be allowed. But it has Jews kind of traveling from across the Jewish world to discuss, and he reveals a lot about Ashkenazi and North African Sephardi Jewry. It's where the literary writers of the present now kind of piggyback off the imaginations of the past.
Thank you very much. I would like to read another comment. Aviva Lev-Ari wrote, "This speaker is a tour de force like no other." I have another question for you. Do the sites you mentioned have multiple identities, i.e. part of the local heritage and history, not just Jewish? And what does it mean for maintaining built Jewish heritage?
Oh, wow. That is a hell of a question. So thank you for the nice words. I mean, even just on the simple level, and this we haven't discussed, I mean, it would be, you know, I'd be more than happy to share some thoughts if we have another chance, but just to say, what is a Jewish site? We haven't discussed that. You know, I mean, I gave you a couple of examples. Is the site looking over, you know, Mitzcheta, looking over the, you know, the site going over from the Javari Church? Is that a Jewish site? So who guards its heritage? Who curates it? Synagogues, cemeteries, libraries, places where things once were, yeah, fine. I mean, it's, you know, this is already kind of into the big sort of brushstrokes of the polemic, of the argument of Jewish travel. But if I was to say, the two most visited sites that Jews in the last 30 years have gone to are not most of the sites I've mentioned. I mean, Israel, yes, but Poland, Auschwitz, why on earth is Auschwitz a Jewish site? It's a site where things happen to the Jews and where the Jews tried to, whatever they tried. So who curates that? You know, Polish government. By the way, the narrative of the Polish government in the more liberal era than the one we're in now is different to the way it's curated now. Now there are legalities about what one is allowed to say there, just acknowledging it and so on and so forth. But even on the simple level, the question of what is a Jewish site, there are less turbulent versions where one would also say those sites where Jewish stuff happened. But at the end of the day, and if I may just say, this is one of, I think, the fascinating things about the Heritage Roots project of the AEPJ, where when it comes to us to curate our own stories, that I think creates, I mean, you know, my colleague Yoel Mansfield from Haifa, you know, threw this one to us early on, and you know, to bring up the politics of how you put up a sign. How do you put up a sign? Just think of any Jewish site that you know around the world which has a Jewish connection. Who writes the sign? Euphemistically, kind of us, whoever us is, the Jewish community, the Jewish people, and so on, or the people who live there. I mean, again, I'm going to pluck one out of nowhere, but outside the Lukishku prison randomly, it's as random can go, the site outside in the Lukishku prison in Vilna, where Menachem Begin was imprisoned, and many, by the way, revolutionaries from the Bund in 1905 were imprisoned in the Lukishku prison. There's no signage outside the Lukishku prison to say this had any Jewish meaning. Jews later on have come to the authorities and asked to put up a plaque. What happens in the Aristotle University of Salonika, which was once the largest Jewish cemetery in Europe, destroyed by the Nazis, but with at least some acknowledgement by local Greek right-wing nationalists. Now there's a university standing on one of our most primal sites in Salonika. It took until very, very recently for someone to have even a memorial, let alone a plaque. So the great mayor, you know, Yanis Butharis, who now is retired from the mayor, you know, celebrated and brought back to the kind of together with Jewish institutions to have at least acknowledgement that this was a Jewish site. So the politics of signage and the politics of remembrance are built into pretty much anywhere we go. And by the way, just so I can keep it controversial and messy and upset some people, how do you think that works in Israel as well? You know, who owns the sites? You know, it's not only the Jewish story that's being told here, and so on and so forth. So you can see, I mean, I thank you for the question. It's really is a kind of, it's a whole other chapter.
Thank you very much. I'm going to, there are two questions that are kind of connected, so I'll ask them together. But beforehand, I just want to say that I put in the chat a link to a survey that we're conducting on our content that we'd very much appreciate if any of you could take the time to fill out. There's also a link to our website where you can see our future events and sign up to them, sign up to our newsletter, and also see the events that we've had so far that we've recorded, including this event, which has been recorded and will go up, God willing, in a few days. There's also a link to donate to the National Library of Israel for whoever wants to and has the ability. And at the end of your answer, I will open microphones so that everyone can thank you personally, and if anyone has any more questions. So the two questions are, first one is from Raleigh. Is the fact that people go or wish to go to pray by the Wailing Wall considered pilgrimage instead of going to the temple? And then the other question is by Linda. How do you address the idea of Jewish memory and that all of our prayers and ritual practices are rooted in the land of Israel? The rituals are passed down throughout generations so that we can retain it in our subconscious.
Oh, that's nothing. Little throwaway questions. So thank you both of you. I mean, this is great stuff. I mean, I think, yes, I think for me, that's why I think when, you know, when I sat with Olga and Karen and we discussed very early on, you know, what this topic has within it, it's why we are in a complicated story, because we've embedded, I mean, Jewish memory, heritage, you know, is embedded in culture, in remembrance. I mean, we're pretty good at remembering. I don't know how good we are at forgetting, but we're pretty good at remembering. So there's a whole literature that's been devoted, you know, and a culture and a representation and a ritual and a practice and artifacts and objects. I mean, without being ridiculous, I'm sure there are other cultures, but, you know, the happiest day of your life, theoretically, I mean, I'll remember my wedding day. I don't know that I was thinking about the destruction of the temple as I was getting married to my wife, but I was somehow ritually obliged to smash a glass to remember that. So there's something of the genius of the Jewish relationship to place, which is the implied journey from one to the other, that contains within it, and that I think needs to be is there to be acknowledged. And so, whether your question, Linda, was a kind of almost just a reference to sort of a celebratory reference, a kind of a compliment or a nod to, I would go with it entirely. I think the intriguing thing for me, by the way, I mean, again, I'm going back to. I think it's a different part of the poem by Amichai. He says, he says, that's why the Jews call their God Makom. One of the names of God in Jewish tradition is Makom, mitzvot, commandments, bein adam lemakom, between a person and God. God is described as makom. Makom means place. So God is a place. But Amichai says, but actually now that we've returned to our place, God has taken up wandering to other places. So now we have to refer to, to God of the places, God of makomot. And, that only just sets the whole thing rolling again, is that, Judaism has this kind of dialogical relationship of dialogue with place, but it will, as I think when we discovered, and when you look at the the exhibition, it's much more about place. It's much more than just the physicality of places. Doron, can you just remind me? I got caught up there. What was the first part? That was Linda's, and the first part of the question was, I think, was it not
regarding the temple?
Oh, so yes, to what degree the Western Wall? I mean, pretty much anything I'm going to say about the Western Wall, the Kotel, will probably upset or annoy or inspire or applaud by somebody. So I'm just going to go with it. I mean, the Jewish people have had an interesting relationship. I mean, where academics and historians have got involved. At what point was the Western Wall as venerated and as sanctified as maybe it's put up to today? Of course, as a source of fascination. And there are certainly those polemicists who argue that actually the Kotel was not quite venerated in the way that we do today. Now we use it as a place both for high points of Jewish celebration and a place to kind of fight each other. And personally, I'm much more in the view that in the same way that communal prayer, which, according to orthodoxy requires the separation of gender, communal prayer was not the dominant prayer by the Western Wall in times past, but has been the practice, since Jews have sovereignty over the area. So that, of course, means that sovereignty, the reclaiming of power, has thrown us a curveball of how do we manage prayer rituals at the Western Wall. Actually, the truth be told, and now I am going to walk right into a hornet's nest here and upset anybody from, well, I don't know whether it's right or left or traditional or secular, whatever, but I'm saying it for educational purposes, so they let me my way out. Those who demand the right of men and women to pray together at the Western Wall, which I am a fan of, don't necessarily always speak as vocally of the right of Jews to pray actually on the Temple Mount itself, close to the Kodesh Kedoshim. And now I understand why, the Israeli army separated, gave the Waqf, the Islamic authorities, the autonomy over the Temple Mount, but that's closer to where, prayer used to take place. I don't know that there are many people who demanded the right of Jews to pray by the mosques ever speak up for liberal Jews who want to pray in mixed gender, down below at the Kotel. There you go. I hope I didn't, but if I did, I hope I did it equally there, offend everybody. But so the question of to what degree stone, the physicality of stone, by the way, important to stress, I mean, maybe this should be an appropriate, should be the starting point or the closing point. I don't know that Judaism sanctifies stone, that there is ultimate holiness in a stone. I'll go with that tradition which says that I don't think that God dwells in a stone, but I understand why we sanctify the idea of God in a stone, whether it's the stones on the top or the stones down below. That is a source, I think, of, well, on the soft level, it's a source of engagement. On the rough level, it's a source of fighting. But not surprisingly, that's the challenge of being a human, of being a Jew, which is you can't imagine everything. At some point, you actually have to live in the world. You actually have to work out either you can pray there or you can't pray there. And that, of course, I will leave to others. to kind of decide, obviously. But for me, I'm interested in that it's sort of the act of returning and being at a place throws up exactly for me what is in that canon of questions, that kind of sacred set of themes and ideas that we're supposed to be grappling with. I'm just intrigued why that one kind of provokes so much anger, given the enormous number of stones around the world which don't create the same level of anger.
Thank you again. Thank you, and thank everybody for being here. I'm going to open everyone's microphones now, and we'll see you all in our next event.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Brilliant.
Thank you, wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful talk.
Great event, and I was very honored to listen to it.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
תודה רבה לכולם ולדורון שדואג לנו. הייתה הרצאה חווייתית, מלאת התלהבות, כל הכבוד.
תודה, תודה.
תודה.
פשוט לא יכולה לפתוח את הוידאו, אז אי אפשר לראות אותי, זה לא עובד אצלי.
אני מאמין שהיית שם.
איפה התערוכה יכולים לראות?
התערוכה זה אונליין. אני אשים את זה עכשיו. זה גם פיזי, אוקיי? אבל זה פיזי באירופה. תחפשו בגוגל Journeys NLI אורגייל ותמצאו אותו. I just put up a link to the virtual exhibition, which is also, yes, great.
And when do we get to go on a tour with you?
With pleasure. Inshallah, we'll be able to do such things at some point in our lives.
Right, so you have to, where is it located even? Where would we find it when you happen?
So jewishjourneys.info, not .org, not .com, .co, but .info. It's not a great site, so but just use that, and then there's an email there, and email me or any of my colleagues in England who work along with. Or I'm sure.
Thank you.
jewishjourneys.com.
No, .info.
Thank you. The tour starting in England? אתה מתחיל?
אני מה?
הסיורים מתחילים מאנגליה?
לא, זה רק שאני בניתי איזשהו פרויקט לפני 20 שנה באנגליה. אז בגלל זה יש לי הפרויקט, זה דרך, התחיל כבר קודם עם איזשהו ארגון באנגליה, ורוב הקולגה שלי היא גם בלונדון, אבל לא, תוכנית, ורוב המשתתפים בא מאנגליה, אבל לא, יש לנו, טוב, כשנתחיל שוב, נתחיל באלסס, כאילו לעשות כל מה שביטלנו קודם. אז אלסס לורן קודם, והיה לנו משהו בוורשה בוודג' ונראה.
ובינתיים אנחנו מקווים שג'רמי יכול להוביל אותנו בסיור וירטואלי גם כן.
בכיף.
עד שסיור
בהונגריה
פיזיקלי.
אני יכולה לתרגם לכם בהונגריה להונגרית, אני גם מדריכה.
It's good to know, thank you.
ג'רמי?
כן.
מאלזס אתה מדבר על היה בית כנסת שהביאו אותו, אני חושבת, לארץ, מאלזס, לא?
לא.
לא היה בתוכנית להעביר איזה בית כנסת מאלזס לארץ?
לא שאני לא.
לא.
אז יש פרופסור אסטריד שהיא פרופסור ליידיש.
כן.
היא דיברה על זה, שכחתי איך קוראים לה, אסטרידית. היא נוצרייה, אבל היא פרופסור ליידיש. היא מאלזס. והיא כל הזמן דיברה על הבית כנסת שהוא עובר לארץ.
אוקיי. משהו מוכר, מאוד מוכר, מה ספציפי, אני לא יודע, אז אני חייב להגיד.
אסטריד שטארק.
כן, לא, אני...
היא פרופסור ליידיש בבאזל.
כן, לא, אני מכיר, היא לא מכירה אותי, אני מכיר את ה... אבל כן, זה היה פרויקט, כן, אבל ספציפית אני לא יודע, אז תודה. אז בכיף, כי אם זה כבר יצא לפועל, אז... במיוחד.
היו צריכים להביא את זה לפסגת זאב, אני הבנתי, לירושלים.
פסגת זאב, וואו. מי ידע?
אוקיי, תודה רבה.
תודה.
תודה רבה לכולם, נתראה באירוע הבא.
תודה רבה, דורון.